The New York Times is reporting tonight that prosecutors have asked questions about boxes of documents being moved not only at Mar-a-Lago, but also at other Trump-owned properties in Florida, including the Trump National Doral Golf Club, which is near Miami, and the Trump National Golf Club in Jupiter, also in Florida. That is according to a person familiar with the matter. That would seem to be some real news here as far as the special counsel's classified documents investigation is concerned. It means that it might not just be the storage rooms and the bathrooms and the ballrooms at Mar-a-Lago with all the boxes of wrongfully retained government documents. There might be more stuff squirreled away at Doral and Jupiter, or at least prosecutors are asking about that, which is wow. Jack Smith and his team are on this. Now, we had an inkling that there might be more to the special counsel's probe down in Florida because late last month, the New York Times also, again, reported that Jack Smith's federal grand jury in Miami was still investigating. That was 3 weeks after Trump had already been indicted on 37 federal criminal counts for his alleged mishandling of classified documents. 3 weeks after that indictment, the Times reported that not only was that grand jury still investigating, but they had issued multiple subpoenas to a handful of people connected to the inquiry. And then just yesterday, in a legal filing about the existing Mar-a-Lago charges, Smith's team wrote explicitly that they had interviewed witnesses as recently as June 23rd, which was by my watch last month, just a few weeks after they filed the first indictment against Trump and his co-conspirator, Walt Nauta. So what about the classified documents case is Jack Smith still investigating? And who might be at risk of being charged now or charged again? As you contemplate that, remember this reporting we got late last month from The Independent. The Independent reported that Jack Smith's team has made preparations to bring what is known as a superseding indictment, or a second set of charges against an already indicted defendant. Essentially, that Smith has made preparations to bring even more charges against Donald Trump in the state of Florida. So it is now a live question as to whether Trump's golf clubs at Doral and Jupiter, whether those places figure into any of that, whether what went down at those clubs might be part of a superseding indictment. Joining me now is Lisa Rubin, MSNBC legal analyst, and our show's secret weapon. Not that secret anymore, because it's so obvious how brilliant you are when it comes to understanding all of the Trump legal news. Lisa, my eyes popped out of my head when I read the words golf clubs, Doral, and Jupiter. Am I wrong to think that this is a significant new reporting?
No, not at all. My eyes did the same. We were not together when we were digesting
I feel safer
news.
in my assessment now.
But, you know, one of the things, Alex, that I think is so interesting about this are Doral and Jupiter are not places that Trump is known to have residences. So when the Department of Justice had earlier said to Trump's lawyers, we think that you're still hiding some documents from us, you need to do more complete searches. Those searches were eventually done, but they were done of residences. They were done of Trump Tower. They were done at Bedminster. Doral is not a place we understand as a place President Trump spends a lot of nights. He did, however, according to news reports, sleep there the night before his Miami arraignment.
Wow.
Jupiter, on the other hand, is about 20 miles from Palm Beach. It's where his son, Donald Trump Jr., now lives. And what I think might be happening here is they are both easy places to get to from Palm Beach, a short drive. So if you were going to want to move certain documents around, not only would you move them within the residence, you'd move them to places outside your universe of residences, right?
In the indictment, we heard, it is written in black and white, that there were some documents moved to Bedminster by Walt Nauta. And we know, of course, of the tape of Trump waving around purported classified documents. That's at Bedminster. And the open question has been, is the DOJ going to charge in Bedminster? Is Bedminster the next place where we're going to see an indictment? Is that what the superseding indictment might be about? Is it in the world of possibility that the superseding indictment actually could be something down in Florida at Doral or Jupiter?
It could be. It could also be lies in testimony or interviews that people gave within Florida about events far outside Florida. So imagine, if you will, that in interviews or, again, grand jury testimony, folks said, no, I never moved a box from Mar-a-Lago to Doral. No, I had nothing to do with the movement of boxes to Jupiter. No, I had no reason to believe boxes were moved to Bedminster. All of those things, if DOJ can prove otherwise, could be the basis of false statement charges. There's already one false statement charge in the existing indictment against Walt Nauta. There could be more to come.
The other reason I want to talk about Doral is because if you are a golf fan, then you know that the Saudi golf organization Live Golf is hosting big tournaments at Doral. And I believe that one of these Doral tournaments from Live Golf, the Saudi-backed professional golf venture, took place in the fall of 2022, which is in and around the time frame that that Mar-a-Lago is being searched, documents are being moved. Am I wrong to be curious about, we know also, sorry, key point here, the New York Times reported earlier this year that one of the previously unreported subpoenas to the Trump Organization sought records pertaining to Mr. Trump's dealings with a Saudi-backed professional golf venture known as Live Golf, which is holding tournaments at some of Mr. Trump's golf resorts. So prosecutors are interested in the relationship between Trump and the Saudi-backed golf organization. There are maybe documents at Doral, and the Saudi-backed golf organization is having events at Doral. I'm connecting dots. Should I not be?
It's not clear, I think, at this point. One thing that I think is clear, though, is that the president's properties are historically insecure. We know from history that Mar-a-Lago has been infiltrated by lots of people, everyone from normal club members to folks just randomly having dinner to folks who have been caught on the property with no business there at all. Certainly, if classified documents are hanging out at a property where they are hosting a public golf tournament, let alone one that's backed by the Saudi Public Investment Fund, that's yet another
That would be
indicator.
a red flag.
Correct.
That would be something you'd want to follow up on. Okay, fair enough. We had this breaking news happen like literally an hour and a half ago. The other breaking news today was the reporting initially from ABC, which was first to report that the DOJ sent a target letter to a Trump staffer down at Mar-a-Lago about his handling of security footage down at the beach club. Can you talk to me about what a target letter signifies and what conclusions you're drawing from this?
Target letter is as close to a warning or indicator as it gets before an indictment that your client is, in fact, very much within the crosshairs of DOJ and is likely to be indicted. It usually goes to the person's counsel. It also serves as a warning. Hey, if you've got a target letter, you can voluntarily come in, but we're letting you know that you're a target so that if we make an invitation to you, you don't come in and give self-incriminating testimony, right? That's really one of the purposes of sending the target letter. I think we now know that this person, who's unnamed in the ABC reports but is represented by Walt Nauta's counsel, Stanley Woodward, is a person who is likely to be indicted. And that makes sense for this reason. When the Department of Justice does additional interviews after an indictment, it can't be in support of the existing charges. That's a big no-no. It has to be in support of either superseding charges or another indictment. So to the extent that the department is saying yesterday, hey, Trump and Nauta, we're about to turn over to you transcripts of interviews that we've conducted between mid-May and mid-June, that's in service of something larger than the indictment that we already know about.
Interesting. I personally, I did not realize, as I've said many times, I did not go to law school, but it did not occur to me that Jack Smith, and we knew that he was still investigating. We knew they were still subpoenaing people. But the fact that he is still looking at, focused on the sort of wheels in the machine, the cogs in the machine, the lower level staffers who were party to allegedly Trump's plot to hide these classified documents is interesting to me and a testament to the special counsel's tenacity in all this, given the fact that they've already indicted the president and his co-conspirator, Walt Nauta, and they got a big January 6th indictment that may be coming down the pike in, the next 10 business days.